Back to the Future. Could it actually happen with a real time machine?
I was devastated. I thought if I could build a time machine that I could go back and see him again and tell him what was going to happen, maybe save his life. And so that became an obsession for me.
He didn't vanish in a flash of light. There was no explosion, no dramatic countdown, no crowd of scientists watching a monitor. There was just a quiet man in a quiet town, alone in a garage on a cold February night in 1997. And then there was nothing. No body. No note explaining where he'd gone. Just a stack of scorched notebooks, a ring of burned grass in the shape of a perfect circle, and a silence that would last 29 years. This is the story of Walter Henning, the man who said he wasn't building a machine to travel through time. He was building one to escape it. And when he came back, what he brought with him was worse than anything the internet had ever guessed. Walter Henning was born in 1958 in a small farming town in central Nebraska, the kind of place where the nearest movie theater was 40 minutes away and the biggest excitement of the year was the county fair. He was not a gifted student. He struggled with reading, was held back a grade, and spent most of his classroom hours staring out the window. But put a soldering iron in his hands, or a broken radio, or a busted television set someone left at the curb, and Walter became a different person entirely. Neighbors remember him as the kid who could fix anything with a motor or a wire, the one who rebuilt a dead lawnmower engine at age 11 just to see if he could. By his 20s, Walter had turned his parents' old machine shed into a personal laboratory. He read every physics textbook he could get his hands on, mostly second-hand copies bought for a few dollars at library sales. And he taught himself electrical engineering through trial, error, and more than a few minor injuries. He never married. He never held a steady job for long. A few years at an appliance repair shop, a stint wiring barns for a local contractor. Because nothing held his attention the way his experiments did. Those who knew him described someone who wasn't chasing fame or money. He was chasing a question, and he couldn't explain to anyone, including himself, exactly what the question was. It started, according to the journals, recovered decades later, with something almost mundane, a high-voltage arc generator he'd built from salvage parts, similar to a Tesla coil, but modified with a feedback loop of his own design. He noticed that when he ran a thin beam of light through the arc at a precise angle, the arc's behavior changed. It stopped flickering the way it normally would, and instead locked into a smooth, stable column, almost like the light was giving the electricity something to hold on to. He began testing small objects near the field, bolts, buttons, a rusted key, and more than once, for a fraction of a second, they seemed to blur at the edges, as if the air itself had gone soft around them. In the fall of 1994, Walter called into a late-night radio program out of Omaha, a small regional show that specialized in strange callers and stranger theories, hosted by a man named Russ Doyle. Walter didn't identify himself by his full name on air. He went only by Walt from the Shed, but the call became something of a local legend among the show's small but devoted audience. He described his arc generator in halting, technical language, clearly more comfortable with wiring diagrams than with talking to strangers. Russ Doyle, an experienced host who had heard every kind of claim over the years, asked him the obvious question. How do you know anything is actually happening, and not just an illusion caused by the brightness of the arc? Walter's answer was strange enough that Russ replayed it on air more than once in later years. He said the objects didn't just look different, they came back cold, colder than the room around them, as if they'd been somewhere with no sun. He said his old dog refused to enter the shed anymore, and that on nights when the field was running, every bird within earshot would go silent at once. Russ told him on air to document everything carefully, to bring in outside witnesses, and to be careful. Walter promised he would. It was the first of what would become nearly a dozen calls over the following 2.5 years, each one stranger than the last. Over 1995, Walter's small experiment grew into an obsession that consumed his entire life. Neighbors say his light stayed on until sunrise most nights. He stopped taking odd jobs entirely and lived off savings and, eventually, off nothing at all. He needed more power than his salvaged equipment could deliver. And in the summer of that year, he did something that would catch up with him fast. He tapped illegally into a nearby agricultural power line, rerouting enough current to run his expanding rig. The result was a power surge that blacked out 3 neighboring farms for the better part of a day. When utility investigators traced the drawback to Walter's shed, he was arrested for theft of services and unauthorized tampering with electrical infrastructure. He served 45 days in the county jail. By every account, jail didn't slow him down, it sharpened him. Fellow inmates and a guard who spoke to a local reporter years later both remembered him sketching circuit diagrams on the backs of meal trays and commissary slips, refining a design he clearly couldn't stop thinking about. When he was released in early 1996, he rebuilt his system from scratch, this time with legally purchased transformers and a far more sophisticated stabilization system built around a rotating array of low-power lasers. On his next call to Russ Doyle's program, his voice had changed. It was tighter, more urgent, carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. He said the effects were no longer subtle. Small items weren't just blurring anymore. They were gone for whole seconds at a time, and when they returned, they weren't quite the same. He described placing a green apple between the coils. It vanished for 4 seconds and came back with brown, withered flesh, as though it had aged for weeks in an instant. He told Russ he'd tried it once with a pet mouse borrowed from a neighbor's terrarium. The mouse disappeared for 6 seconds, and when it reappeared, it moved erratically, refused food, and died within 48 hours. Russ, clearly rattled, urged him on air to stop experimenting alone, to bring in a university physics department, to get real oversight before someone got hurt. Walter's response was quiet and unsettling. He said he wasn't sure anyone could stop it now, including himself. Walter's final call came in the last week of February 1997. He told Russ he had expanded the field radius significantly, large enough now that he could stand at its very edge himself. He said that when he did, time behaved differently around him, not faster or slower exactly, but stretched like a held breath. He described watching dust motes hang motionless in the air while his own hands still moved normally. When he stepped back out of the field, he said more time had passed on the shed's wall clock than he'd experienced standing inside it, sometimes by several minutes. Russ asked him directly on air if he believed he'd built a time machine. Walter paused for a long moment before answering. He said he didn't think that was the right word for it. Something was being disrupted, he said, not time exactly, but the thread connecting a person to the moment they're standing in. He promised to call back in March with hard evidence. Video, instrument readings, everything Russ had been asking for since the beginning. That call never came. Through March, Walter's phone number went dead. Mail sent to his address came back undeliverable. A neighbor who drove past reported that the property looked abandoned. Curtains drawn, no lights, no movement. On the night of March 22, 1997, the shed burned to the ground. Firefighters found melted copper coils, the collapsed skeleton of transformers, and most strikingly, a nearly perfect circle of scorched earth roughly 8 feet across where the fire seemed to have burned hottest. There was no body. There was only a single spiral notebook, its cover charred but its pages intact, tucked inside a fireproof lockbox that had somehow survived. On the final page, in Walter's unmistakable handwriting, was a single line. It was never about leaving. It was about not being seen. Local police ruled it an unsolved disappearance, likely a case of a man fleeing before his own fire could catch up with the legal consequences of his earlier arrest. The file was left open but untouched for decades. Online, however, the story took on a life of its own. By the early 2000s, forum threads and message boards had turned Walter Henning into a kind of folk legend. The backyard tinkerer who cracked something no government lab ever could and paid for it by disappearing entirely. Theories multiplied. He'd traveled forward, he'd traveled backward, he'd been quietly taken by federal agents who didn't want the technology getting out, or he'd simply faked his own disappearance to escape debts and a criminal record. Radio archivists occasionally rebroadcast the old calls, and each time, a new wave of listeners discovered the mystery and added their own theories to the pile. For nearly 3 decades, that's where the story stayed. A strange footnote in the history of amateur radio call-in shows, filed somewhere between urban legend and cautionary tale. In the spring of 2026, a young couple renovating an old farmhouse outside the same Nebraska town found a heavy metal case hidden beneath the floorboards of an upstairs closet. in a house that had changed hands 3 times since 1997 and had no known connection to Walter's family. Inside were dozens of notebooks filled with diagrams, dated entries stretching from 1997 all the way to 2024, and a single photograph of a man standing beside a large ring-shaped metal frame, time-stamped only months earlier. On the back, in the same handwriting from the fireproof notebook, was written, "It worked. Just not the way I meant it to." Word spread quickly online once the couple posted about the discovery. Less than a month later, a man matching Walter's description, now clearly in his late 60s, appeared unannounced at the local historical society, asking quiet questions about his own case file. He gave interviews to no one and disappeared from town again within days, but not before speaking, briefly and reluctantly, to the couple who had found his case. What he told them was not a story of traveling through decades. According to Walter, the field he had built didn't move him through time at all. It pulled him sideways, out of the normal rhythm that connects a person to the people around them. He described it as being present in every room he entered, but somehow harder and harder for people to hold on to, like a name on the tip of the tongue that never quite arrives. Landlords forgot renting to him. Old acquaintances remembered his face, but not his name. Every time he tested the field on himself in those final years before the fire, he said, the effect deepened, not erasing him from existence, but eroding his place in everyone else's memory of the world. He told them he'd spent 29 years drifting through small towns and temporary jobs, always somewhere that didn't require anyone to remember him for long, all the while trying to understand exactly what he'd broken and whether it could be undone. He said he'd hidden the notebooks years in advance in a location he calculated would remain stable, waiting for the right people to find them before he faded past the point of being noticed at all. Before he left the couple's porch that evening, he asked only one thing, that the notebooks be sent to a research archive rather than repeated by anyone at home, so the effect he triggered would never be recklessly rebuilt. The couple say that within hours of Walter walking away down the gravel road, the details of his face had already begun slipping from memory, the way a dream dissolves the moment you try to describe it out loud. They wrote down everything they could remember that same night, and even those notes, they admit, read now like second-hand accounts of someone else's encounter rather than their own. Whatever Walter Henning actually discovered in that shed in the 1990s, it doesn't seem to have been a door into the past or the future. It seems, if his own account is to be believed, to have been something closer to a door out of other people's attention altogether, a slow, quiet unraveling of the thread that keeps any of us solid in the minds of everyone around us. Somewhere out there, if his story is true, Walter Henning is still walking through a world that can barely hold onto the idea of him, present and breathing and real, and steadily becoming impossible to remember.